Morning, everyone. We're
Progress.
April 21st. Before we coming on a Friday morning, just some housekeeping. Our assembly area at the corner of North Bucks in the main lobby. Restroom of the double doors. Members of the public, thank you. When the board is ready to encouraged to complete a blue or the item is her and function in you're dialing in. Attended in person to speak, raise their hand in Zoom. Next muted until you're ready to speak. Please call my hand waving or whatever. I'd also like to request to mute your device. Could you please call the roll?
Absent. Here. Here. Member Dean. Member Ford. Member Jane. Thank you. Absent. Member Kamei. Member Lee. Thank you.
Here.
Here.
Absent. No. Alternate member Rennie. Member Torres. Absent. Vice Chairperson. Absent. Chairperson. Chairperson, you have a quorum.
So we'll now move on. Is to review 24 and annual budget. Provide the presentation.
Thank you very much. And as the chair said, not only for here for a budget discussion. Before we some people, really everybody who budget that we're about spot here. Our budget team has been. This really was with VTA process, but going some those as we go through this. Like to commitment, dedication, and stand up. So Jeff. You know, this ask to take on, and on top of that, me and size in this process, everything that she's done. I will say we've got a presentation that we're going to go through, put in here for to the very end for us to have a little more of a that public comment, Mr. Chair, if that. Through this, as it states up budget for fiscal year. I do want to focus mostly be on discussion. We'll look to some of the other. I'll give you an update on where it relates to transit some policy changes when in June, and of course from the board here. So the budget are listed here. I'll go through them again. The focus will be mainly on VTA operations, but we will funds as the situations that are for each of these funds, and most of these we walk through. Utilize it. Perfect or perfect description of how monies flow. But imagine maybe for some to sort of see to us, and then ultimately in this whole process was really on the VTA fund capital. For the most part, all of the different going through. For 1976, for the most part, 100% side. And all of that can flow through transit capital. Is the one you guys are you're asking questions? And that do it. So an accountant and a board member.
Have the presentation.
One right there. All right. Now we can go to the man. Just yep. This as it relates to the budget. Meeting the needs of our passengers. list. But with all times be limited. This next biennial budget passengers side of the house. Relate to everything else. Referred to as the significant events that in the core elements of that and trans today's environment right now, we're in that revitalization on cultivating our reimagining our programs and performance complement each other. In fact, it's not success, but commitment. I would ask members, you should best to just walk through that. I'm on conversation really focus. What we were just talking about, what the current budget is. I would start with circle run wise. Study all of these efforts done or work this training, engagement, and all VTA, whether that's technology, everything included in our folks are want to go to and then limitations. Some might say for now, but I think and that's going to be in the form improvements, and then safety and security, timely, efficient passengers. It is, I think, up on again, just on the people into each of these individuals, but to highlight there's improvements that I'll raise to your to help break down some barriers whether individually and as mentioned before, we have a the standard opportunities. It is also aimed at changing policies around recruiting. Is intended to efforts that we've seen in the process to move forward. Resource planning is the next for the next decade. But it also and provides solutions, workflow, overall streamlining to streamline it. Lastly, under performance, performance is cost per passenger, all of for our long-term, ensuring that we responsibility is all. And we are connecting 10. Oh,
Okay.
they took. Now we'll talk a little bit that you're seeing right now. Consider the highlights, and most as far as where the initiatives we want to offer. Retention is 25 again. I think had endeavored to do, as well as this board, this budget. The next slide. For comparison, we'll almost always projected for 24 happens to show fiscal year 4 and 25 revenue and $3.6 million respectively. The increase and each prior year to be 558 and 585, and those are again increases of 9 effectively. And we'll take a starting with. So on the next slide, the breakdown total perspective 603 fiscal year 24 is compared to what we are currently at about. Each of the revenues are shown on just a couple of them. This is actually showing 23, which might raise. This is more average, assuming for fiscal year, not necessarily right. Discussed over the last little up over the last couple of our smart, along with actual ride, that to continue as it is on. We anticipate increase on that, seeing that average historically 90-cent range. STA, TDA, and STAB, those and their estimates. One thing to note: reduce the TDA amount for the outstanding legal tax collections. As a side note, of that $10 million up, and a half to served that amount. Case not in our favor that we cannot have a bottom line. Other, we always other has really three. One, Measure A repayment. Another line item and then the last one. Earnings is actually as we've projected for the most part. It's changed over the last 15 months. Investments. So our month, 1 year instruments, a very paltry good of 20 to over the last rates increased dramatically. Securities instead of a 50 basis of a 350. So we've projected. I'm a little concerned, but true. On the next screen, because it's got a little action. Do comparison. So this is just showing you just since fiscal year 25. The revenues. Main item on this one is fiscal year 22. That's really related to received brief in 23, 24. As you click the last, it'll, and we've talked a little bit about showing a decrease 25. It's not as ridership numbers we out the ridership. That's a business. The first item that came up, and again showing some forward. The next one, each of these is you can click the light rail thing. 70% of what by fiscal that we're showing 1 point. That would be about that pre-pandemic, and closer as we move forward. And then I believe the last is really the talked about before as far as this is just showing where we were to that average fare because of the mix of 23. It's starting to come down, and we're just simply as leadership. I think everyone where the trends are, that when you look at in that 19, things were moving at COVID hits. Longer to be expected. Tragedy when in a period of time.
So operating 23 is decreasing.
Actually, standard, the measure B, there was in previous year provided into the, and so that number is now calculation in 24 and 25 component.
Okay.
Looking at the trend, if you could better, I appreciate it. Payment. So the biggest that's very fast. 18 for the year of 22 to 44.53. If you could break down
On the other revenue for 21 and 20 to in fiscal federal relief dollars and so that would have been reflected predominantly $102 million. Additional as well as ARP dollars reflected as other revenues. 204 again is the on the which is the rest of it does measure other elements within.
and as far as one is
Yes.
yes, and modeling some of that back.
Expecting identified as me there's many period that we could do anything that would be anticipating any but definitely
And then the funds as 50 basis points. We're talking about now we're getting 3.5. Now, so I just for this agency, do we have money around to get the best?
we have a group really manage most of our and pretty much on a quarterly basis a month and a half ago and talking and what they're doing. So their portfolio that we have, which of course, you know, from conservative opportunities to move some of those previous those those into longer term. 6 month, do we go in and just trying to identify definitely moving out of
Years because rates of 10 we are now in the reverse. Short terms actually way.
we're seeing the benefits.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Lee Ying.
For the report. Are we not anticipating federal and we have.
No, anticipate to be federal and or state operations perspective. Not necessarily into nothing extraordinary. Cares Carissa Arp that but just the and state grants for operations purposes.
Might you money and not just revenue?
That's all.
And maybe calling that out in case that.
From that perspective, all of the federal grants, type grants like that, are part of the overall capital once we get to that point.
Director Jane.
Similar question. If you could measure at the by 4.1, sales tax would be the same. Where a certain the sales tax goes, and unless that change difference between 2%.
You're I go back and look to see is all of those.
That's what I would expect.
There are sales taxes that can't say today that do a 4%. The assumptions that we made related to operations, it's not, that would not, so we'll make sure.
Okay, and my that's and I would that there was some change. There's a bill thing by 3.5, but why would it go to 45 until volume electrify and moved over to renewable?
Yeah, and it's that's where I came in here. I need to go back.
Because I would expect that diesel will go to
Go
zero.
down.
Director Lopez.
Slide, please. What's included in the category under expense?
Most of that's going to be the ACE or Express that we have. That's going to be in those particular.
Okay. Where is that coming from?
So again, we'll we've historically is our money from operating in capital fund, actually. And that's how it goes into that capital.
Behind how
Sure that we've got the expense, state a good of projects that for because without to keep it more capital all coming from we have to identify that then pay for the this is what that is attempting.
that at the potential operating.
It can I would offer that most likely is we don't want to reduce what may have especially when we look at the transfer to
Okay, thank you.
I had a really, I'd see it's 45 going to capital. Because if we, this in state funds.
matching dollars that grants that were out. It might simply be for items that are grant related across
what degree missionary projection the next year or two?
into the next 2 years, the services revenue projections. They have a higher level. The numbers are. Relatively, the ACE commuter itself, which is shared costs between VTA, Altamont, CMA, and then the San Joaquin Regional Rail Commission. And the second is our contract with Avalon, who runs the ACE shuttle from the Great America Station to various destination points. For that particular one, for fiscal years 22 and 23, ACE had received, again like us, federal relief dollars, and they were able to apply those dollars to the cost of that ACE commuter, and in turn, that reduced our overall share that we needed to provide. That is no longer happening in 24 and 25. So because those credits are no longer going to be seen, the increase in the ACE commuter element is going to go up by about $3 million. So those two combined are what's driving that contracted services item from about $27.5 to the $36.4 million. Next slide. And as we talked about on the previous slide, the service delivery represents about 83.3% of the total operating budget, with labor representing about 72.7% of the total service delivery. So we'll touch on that piece in a couple more in another slide or two. But items of note below that labor cost item that I'd like to touch on, and unfortunately we don't have the fiscal year 23 reference here, but I'll let you know the increase or decrease compared to 23 when I say this. So on the materials and supplies, it's an increase of about $6 million. Main driver in this category is really our emphasis on part availability and overall utilization to make sure that the fleet is up and running and things are running well on the part side. From a security perspective, it's an increase of about $2 million, and that reflects estimated contract value for the Sheriff's Office and our Allied Universal contracts. For fuel and traction power, we're actually anticipating a decrease of about $3.5 million. There is some increase in the traction power component, but we are expecting fuel prices, diesel fuel prices, to continue to go down, especially compared to what we saw in fiscal year 23. And then for other operating expenses, this reflects about an $11.1 million increase versus fiscal year 23. And areas where this is most seen is really on employee-related expenses. This is an increase of about $1.5 million. This is where we're putting money in for training, workshops, industry engagement, overall employee recognition, again, things to ensure that we're taking care of the employee. Technology-wise, there's an increase of about $2.8 million. Again, this is to focus on cloud-based migration, overall hardware and software enhancement and support, and then cybersecurity initiatives. And then professional services. This is going to be a host of things that are going on that has an increase of about $7.1 million. Recruiting and retention services, federal policy and grant assistance, procurement initiatives, operations training, JWI initiatives, apprenticeship programs, standing up an emergency management program. Overall security and cybersecurity vulnerability assessments and overall programs are just some of the main elements that are driving those particular costs. You go to the next slide, we start talking about the drivers of labor cost. So one of the elements on the labor side is the operator salaries, and operator salaries are really driven by the transit service levels that are assumed as we move forward. The current service level, and really more about the service hours, is the major variable in that budget. We've been using what we refer to as a full service level approved with the 2019 new transit service plan for the last couple of years. Basically what we'll do is we'll identify a base year of overall service, identify what the average rate was at that time based on dollars and actual service, identify what that rate is, and then build up from that rate to take into consideration step increases, labor negotiation agreements, things of that nature, get to a new rate, and then use that rate with this particular service level of hours. And that's how we'll determine the overall dollars budgeted for the operator side, that being the bus and light rail operators. As we move to the next slide, it talks a little bit more about other elements within the labor and overall benefits. So along with the operator pay, the other labor and benefit assumptions are shown here. Salaries for all employees are assumed at current labor agreements. And for the non-represented employees, they basically mirror right now in the assumptions, the union contracts. Any projected impact of the class and compensation study is not included in the budget. I want to make sure that everyone knows that. We've not tried to assume what the class and compensation study will reveal. However, we will be prepared to bring any of those adjustments to the board if needed when they are known. And I want to make sure that's understood, that when that study is done and whatever the results of that study are, and once we've negotiated everything we need to, we plan to enact whatever that class and compensation study tells us. That's the promise we've made, and that's what we're going to do as it relates to the employees. Additionally, training salaries are budgeted for $2 million, and this is really to capture the desired increase in frequency and size of classes as we move forward in overall training and bringing on more operators. Now, I would like to spend a few minutes on a block that's listed as total positions on this page. So the previous approved budget, which would have been back in 21-ish, had 2,365 authorized positions. For fiscal year 24, we're proposing a budget with 2,391 positions, an increase of, 26 positions. Now, this increase is in alignment with what we talked about earlier on the operation focus and building the necessary support throughout the entire organization. Some examples of this, just to lay it out a little bit for you. So positions in certain areas. So positions have been added in the administrative services area, most widely known as human resources, to support each of the yards with HR-related tasks, to eliminate some of that day-to-day stuff that the yards were having to do that really were more HR-related functions. And so putting folks in the yards, HR-related, is a tremendous benefit to both the yards and the work that they're doing, but also on the HR side. Other positions have been added in this group to improve recruiting and hiring efforts and focus on overall workforce development throughout the entire agency. Again, all critical items that have been, I'll call it a source of frustration for a lot within the agency over the last several years. Technology will be adding approximately 6 positions to support critical applications and overall cloud migration efforts. Procurement and operations together have added approximately 5 new parts clerk positions to address the pressing issues with parts inventory and maintenance needs. Operations has added positions to support maintenance efforts, more specifically a deputy director for maintenance, which will provide a little bit more focus specifically on maintenance, where now it's having to be shared between our deputy directors for light rail and bus operations. But on top of that, also technical training, regional transportation support, and overall workforce development. Procurement is also adding contract administration positions to support all divisions and their contracting needs. And then security is adding positions to support cybersecurity efforts, physical security initiatives, and overall emergency management. The focus here, as we said before, is for the last several years, and now I'm going a little off script, we've said no too many times as an organization, as an agency. People have needed to do things, and the response for the most part has been no for whatever reason. And that needs to change. We need to be able to put people in place to be able to do the things they need to do to, again, support each other as an organization, but also support overall operations for the core of what we do as an agency. And so that's where that focus has been for the last, call it 6-8 months, in ensuring that we're getting these positions created and built so that we can continue to move forward. Now, along with the positions, we've also done some organizational shifts to better align roles and responsibilities. 2 here are, several years ago, the parts group was moved out of operations and combined with procurement. That sort of created a disconnect that has, exacerbated some of our situation on the parts side for the last couple of years. No fault of anybody who's in those positions. It's just the alignment piece and just how the process works because of that alignment. So to properly align that team with the folks they work more closely with, we've moved that organization back into operations. So there's a much more linear relationship for that group. And then additionally, the technical training element has moved back to operations from the administrative services. And this is, again, to focus and energy can be solely on the operators and their overall needs. At the same time, the byproduct of this, it also allows the administrative services team to develop a more corporate-wide workforce development program, ensuring that every employee has opportunities for career training. So if we move to the next slide, I'm not going to touch on this one much because we have really touched on all of these things. Again, the focus of people, programs, and performance, and some of the items within the budget that address each of these areas that really I've highlighted in the past, but wanted this slide to be there for you just as a reference point. The next slide talks a little bit about budget assumption risks. I would say that most of these budget assumption risks are your typical areas of concern. However, the one that I do want to focus on and make sure that this group understands and can appreciate changes that could occur is really in the new initiatives. There are several initiatives, and I couldn't name them all, but those that I've listed here, Ridership Task Force, a Parts Task Force, Light Rail Study. Each of these easily could result in programs or initiatives important to VTA's future. Additionally, we have new leadership in critical positions. And not to call him out, but I fully expect that Derek, our Chief Operating Officer, is going to identify resource needs for operational support that are critical for us to move forward. Additionally, Aston Green on the security side I know he will see areas of concern, whether it's physical or cyber, that need to be addressed. And when they're ready to bring those forward, we need to hear them. We need to be ready to move on those. And it's those initiatives that will create opportunities for us, again, on my little creative slide a long time ago, is to figure out that balance of how we meet those needs and at the same time understanding the resource capacities that we have. Next slide is the busy slide of our 10-year projection. This, I would say, represents our current estimate of our next 10 years. And again, I would say this is still a relatively simple, straightforward approach in just putting forward a 10-year projection. As we start talking more about long-term fiscal sustainability and we start having those conversations that the board wants to engage in, we'll get a little bit more particular about some of these assumptions and have varying levels of things or varying assumptions for the board to review. But in this one, I would consider it a very simple, straightforward approach. Revenues are growing at approximately 3% for fiscal years 26 through 29, and then 2% for the remainder. Expenses generally are growing at about 3.5%, so they are growing faster than revenues for 26 through 29, and then 2.5% for the remainder. And some items of note, we are continuing, just so everyone is aware, and the Auditor General hears me when I say this. We are showing that we will continue to fund the necessary increase to the operating reserve, so it stays at its required 15%. But the item of note that, Member Lopez, you had brought up before, is on the capital transfer piece. So the capital transfer, although we're showing it in 24-25 at $40 million, it's being reduced to ensure that we have a operating balance of zero, so it's a balanced budget, and that is the mechanism that we would use to get to a balanced budget. Now, there can be conversations about should it move or should something else move, but the way we've projected it right now is that is the mechanism that is the kind of the tipping point. And so we're seeing that decrease, and that is a risk from an overall capital perspective and the needs that we have as an organization. The next question that some would ask, and I would anticipate it, and I'm good with it, is the last time we looked at a 10-year projection, it was an absolute dire situation, and the sky was going to fall. And you're right, it did look that way. And I would say that this is really more a matter of timing. If you look at the fiscal year, if you look at the budget workbook and the 10-year projection that was done then, the base year that would have been used to determine the projection then would have been fiscal year 23, and then everything would have been built off of 23. Revenue that was identified in fiscal year 23 at that time was about $530 million. So we're currently projecting fiscal year 23 revenues to be $578 million. So just simply the time element, things change, and we all knew this. The next time I come forward, hopefully it won't be me, it'll be Jessica next time we come forward with this, but the next time we come forward with a budget presentation for the next biennial cycle, it's very possible that this could turn negative again. So I want to caution us when we look at this to say this is the absolute. I think it definitely identifies, the previous one identified for me, there's issues that we need to address. And I'm not changing my opinion based on this. It's just letting us see where we think things can be if they continue on the current path. So that's what this one is showing us as we exist now. And with that, I will break again and ask for feedback questions. This should be fun.
Director Davis.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
I appreciate the detail, and I have a couple of questions for further detail. Going back to labor and benefits, a couple of questions on the pension contribution, OPEB, and medical insurance. I see that pension and OPEB are decreasing, and OPEB is decreasing by quite a bit. What's behind those projections? Because at least in the city of San Jose, we don't ever see that.
Yeah, right now, as far as the projections that we've received from our actuary, especially on the pension side, that's reflective of what our current estimates were. I do believe that by the time we had put this together, the new actuarial study had come in, and the FY '24 number could go up by about $1.5 million, I think. I think the number, we had projected on the, I think on the ATU pension, we had anticipated about a $28 million contribution from VTA. I think that's now going to be closer to 30 based on the studies that we just received. So there might be a slight increase from that perspective. But it's also an effort, I think there's more of a 5-year averaging methodology that's used, so you're not going to necessarily see tremendous spikes one way or the other. But we do have to monitor and make sure that we're not seeing trends that will all of a sudden kick it up in that 5th year. On the
It's all
OPEB
part of
side,
CalPERS?
I'm sorry,
It's all part of CalPERS?
CalPERS or the ATU pension. We separate pensions for that.
Okay.
On the OPEB side, this was, I would call it a mechanism in some cases to get us to a balanced budget. This was one area where I had some flexibility, where I felt we had some flexibility. Our OPEB right now, don't quote me on this, but it's pretty close. We're actually overfunded. We're sitting at about 130% from a funding perspective. So there's flexibility for us to actually reduce the contribution that VTA is needing to make. The actuary actually shows that no contribution is necessary. We've continued to make those contributions for the last several years. And we'll continue to make these contributions if for no other reason. What I didn't want to see was a complete reduction, and then you've got that gap to fill later on when you actually do have to start funding it. So we wanted to continue keeping that contribution moving forward, but we just reduced it a little bit.
Okay, and then for medical insurance, that's about 5% increase?
About.
Is that historically what you're finding for medical insurance? Healthcare goes up so much that seemed low to me.
Yeah, and that's, I'll be honest, that's one area where I need to follow up with Sonia and our Chief People Officer and just confirm what we're seeing as far as cost increase. What we've done on this is, to your point, we just simply assumed about a 5%, but something tells me Sonia's right behind me and she's going to jump all over this.
Indeed.
Well, sure. If you,
Okay. Thanks. I'm Sonia Morrison, Chief People Officer. The reason that the medical is around 5% is the majority of people have Kaiser insurance. And Kaiser is historically between 3.5%, 4.5%, 5%. While some of the PPO plans do go up by double digits because of the number of people that keeps ours at around 5%.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Understand all of that. And then going to the 10-year projection, if I may, Chair. Thank you. Question about debt service on the 10-year projection. It goes down by quite a bit. Are we paying off something large between FY26 and FY27?
yeah, so the amount that is contributed from the Measure A bond payback, so we've got a revenue amount that actually comes in, and then that's to pay for that debt associated to this piece of the operation, and so that will ultimately be rolling off. So there's actually a net, we've actually reduced the revenue as well as that expense. So it's really a net neutral from that perspective.
Got it. Great. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Director Kamei.
Thank you. Going back to the labor and benefits, I'm just trying to clarify what I heard on the potential impact of the classification and compensation study.
Mm-hmm.
How frequently do you do it, and how extensive in terms of magnitude is the impact? Because I'm thinking, is it small? Is it medium? Is it going to be a big surprise? I'm just wondering how extensive in terms of classifications you've gone.
Now that I know that Sonia Morrison is in the house, I'm going to look to her and see if she can, if she wants to respond.
So we are looking at all the classifications. It's around about 320 classifications covering all people. The last time we did really an extensive one like this, I think we did a mini one in about 2015 that wasn't implemented, and maybe 2007 was the last full one. It's really hard to gauge what the impact is going to be, but the impacts are subject to negotiations and budget impact, so.
Yeah, so I just, it sounded like whatever it turns out to be, there's a commitment that it will follow. It's just, sort of like getting prepared for whether or not it's going to be a big number, sort of, well, this is what it is because it hasn't been done. So I just was wondering in terms of how much of an impact it would be, since it sounds like you've already committed to it.
Well, I want to say that, and I'll say this. We've committed to making sure, because I think one of the items that Sonia mentioned there was the last time we did any sort of a study was back in 2015, and if you heard her say it, and it was really never acted upon.
Right.
So that's an issue that we've got with credibility with the employees, and as we go through this process, there has to be action that's taken on this particular study. So I think there will be action. I don't want to make it sound like it is an open checkbook. I think as we get those results and we understand what the overall study tells us, to Sonia's point, there will be some negotiations that will go on. There may be phasing approaches that we have to take. But one way or the other, we have to make sure that we're doing the things that we need to do to address what we see from that class and comp study to make sure that we're taking care of the employees.
Okay, that sounds reasonable. Thank you. And then, if I may, back to the 10-year projection. I was just curious in terms of when you're making assumptions over that period of time, as projects move from capital improvement to starting to operating, has that been taken into account when you're looking at these 10-year projections?
Very good question. And I would probably say no, not the way it should be. Because again, these projections right now are just sort of building off of the prior year with standard growth. I think when we start looking at that long-term fiscal sustainability initiative, I think those are areas that we need to take into consideration, for instance, in EBRC. Right. And when EBRC is fully constructed and it comes online, there will be operational costs that we need to make sure are taken into consideration that are built into any sort of projections we make longer term. So those are areas specifically that I would say we need to address, yes.
Yeah, I'd be interested in, sort of understanding how it is that you start looking at your revenue side in terms of what's going to be needed, especially as some of these really big projects start coming on, online, because it's going to take time to be able to make the numbers that you need. So,
right.
Thank you.
And I'll say, and that's, to me, that's what this helps us do. It just gives a little bit visibility into that future. It identifies certain areas that might be of issue that we have to then at least recognize something has to change. And to that point, whether it's cost, I think we fully recognize another revenue source will be needed. As most of us have seen, we're not going to, if there's deficits that are created, most likely they're not going to be reductions in cost that get us to solving that number, assuming the service that we want to provide continues to be what we provide. So another revenue source, and whether that's an external source or whether it's developing the express lanes or developing the TOD part of the equation, I mean, all of these things are things as we look long term as far as how we find those revenue streams.
Director Lopez?
I'm going to continue the pattern and go to the same two slides in the same order. So I have a question as we get into fiscal years 24 and 25 around the number of positions, and if I heard correctly, a lot of those planned positions are actually administrative in nature. Which makes sense, but just I'm looking at that, and then at the vacancy rate holding steady for 24 and 25. How do you square that with not just the need, the gap in operator positions that we need to fill, but also with the, as we heard yesterday at SSTPO, all the great apprenticeship programs and other investments that we're making in employee training and building that pipeline in I think a very aggressive and forward-looking way. But could you just speak to that and the thinking on the positions and vacancy rates?
Sure. I think what we're seeing on the operator side, the vacancy rate is still relatively high, and that's one of those areas that Derek and the rest of the team are really working hard to fix. And that's where, when we talked about operator training budget, the hope is to increase the size and increase the frequency of getting some of those operators on board. If we're able to fill those positions, then we can start having conversations about increases in service or increases in other areas within the operation side. The positions that have been filled are the ones that either have been filled in part of this budget or will be part of the budget as we move forward. You know, the idea here is that even on the hiring side, hiring and the recruiting and the retention piece, those are areas that were somewhat, I'll say, lacking or maybe a little deficient in the past. And these positions that have been created to help really bolster that effort to ensure that we're out there recruiting and finding the operators we need. But on top of that, it's all of the other support areas. So whether it's safety and security, whether it's the technology side, they all might be referred to as administrative type positions, but they're ultimately supporting overall operations. So when systems go down, that becomes an issue for operations. So what we need to do is make sure that we've got the proper support in place, that those systems don't go down. And it's those types of positions that we are identifying as we move forward to ensure that that operation stays in place.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, just to be clear, I'm not questioning the need for the administrative positions. I think the areas you outlined are more important. I'm more asking if we see reflected here the need for those operator positions and how we're thinking of our long-term growth in those areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think overall, we do recognize the need for the operators. I think what we do recognize is the ability to fill is still rather difficult. The percentage right now, I want to say, is probably close to a 10-11% vacancy rate for the operator side. You know, we've got identified, call it a core number of, I think, 924 bus operators and 135 light rail operators. If we fill all of those, I think we would love it. But that also implies that you don't have, you've got a lot of attrition that's going on as well. So getting to that number is going to be more and more difficult. But I think every effort's in place right now to ensure that we get those folks on board as quickly as we can and as best we can.
And I see that. I guess what I'm asking is I don't necessarily see that reflected in the numbers that are presented here for 24 and 25, or are we just thinking that's going to take longer than that to fill?
No. Well, I don't think right now there's a push to increase the number of authorized positions, so that 924 and 135. The push right now is let's at least get to that number. If we can get to that number, then we can start having a conversation about are we needing more to then provide more service. So there wasn't a push at this point to necessarily add positions in that operator side, being the bus and light rail. But as this 2-year cycle goes on, and if we get to the point where we filled what is now the 924 and 135, and then see that need further, then we'll address that one when it comes up.
So maybe I'm not. I guess then I question why we anticipate the vacancy rate here holding steady rather than going down.
Well, that's not. And I'm sorry. This vacancy rate is for the entire organization, so it's for all 2,400 positions. Just generally speaking, there's going to be a vacancy rate across the agency that we anticipate occurring. It's historically, for the last couple of years, been in that double-digit number. For budget purposes, we're just simply hoping that number comes down. I would expect that, most agencies, it might be a 5 or 6% vacancy rate, maybe a little bit higher. If we can get to an 8% number, I think we'd probably be pleased. Something tells me Sonia Morrison just stepped up to the mic right behind me. So.
Yes, so you are correct. 6 to 8% is a general across the board. You never get to full employment as people leave. Ours, I think, will be closer to 8% because of the operators. We currently have 872 operators out of the 924 budgeted. But great news, next week starts our first full operator training class. So we have been getting closer and closer and closer to our full, and we're running constant operator classes right now. So I think that 6 to 8% is really, 8% is probably a good number.
Great, and just to be clear, I'm extremely supportive of all these efforts we're doing to build that pipeline. So I just want to make sure it's reflected in what we're funding. But I appreciate the context. Thank you.
Yep. Director Blankley.
Thank you. I'm going to harp on one of the same slides, not the exact same one, but on the 10-year projection, and even going back, the 10-year projection starts with fiscal year 24, but even including fiscal year 23 and an earlier one, I know that labor is 83%, right, of cost. I mean, I think that's not unlike most of our cities. But when I look at the increase in total, the anticipated increase in total operating revenue, dollar for dollar, the increase in just the labor line alone is equal to or more than that, dollar for dollar of the revenue increase. And number one, I'd like you to address why you think that might be, since that's 100% or more of that. And I realize it still balances because you're plugging the capital, I'm sorry, I used the word plug myself, but yeah, you're plugging the capital fund number so that the budget comes to zero. But that then takes me to service levels where, my fear, being from Gilroy, is that, our existing service levels are disproportionate throughout the county. So I'm trying to look ahead to getting service in Gilroy and Morgan Hill that is at least the same level in terms of number of routes, in terms of frequency, that all the other cities in Santa Clara County get. Because we're paying the same level of sales tax per person into the same revenue pool, but it doesn't come back to Gilroy and Morgan Hill in the same way in terms of transit service. So can you address the rising labor, just that, how this is going to come to work out?
I think what hopefully, I don't like using the word hopefully, what should happen as we get through these next 2 years, fiscal 24 and 25. I'll use the word maybe some inefficiencies. I think there's inefficiencies in overall labor costs that we have today, and whether that's residual from the pandemic and have just kind of continued on, whether it's sick, maybe overtime, other areas that have just allowed that cost to continue to creep up. We need to identify what those issues are. We talked about it yesterday in SSTPO as far as labor or light rail cost, the overall cost of operations. Trying to identify what those issues are and then fix those. And the idea would be hopefully we've identified some of those labor areas that can then reduce what we're seeing here. If we can't, then in theory, later on, there has to be a conversation ultimately of, if we can't support the service that we're providing out there, then decisions need to be made. That's not the decision at this point that we're wanting to make. We believe right now that cutting is not the option. Reducing is not the option. I'm not saying we're not looking at this and saying, okay, decisions may need to be made later on in some form or fashion. But the idea today is we've got to do what we need to do to bring the service level to what the people need. Hopefully be able to identify to not only the riders but also the general public that this is the service that's being provided. It's a tremendous service not only to those who use it but to those within the county. And whether that becomes another measure, whether that becomes some other mechanism for us to generate revenue, but we have to have a service, we have to have a product that people can support. And so that's where currently you're not going to see us talk about potential reduction. It's not to say that we don't have to have that conversation in the next 4, 5, 6 years if things don't pan out the way we anticipate them.
Yeah. Thank you for that answer. The last thing I'm going to say is that when you refer to things like what people need, services to what people need, I just want to caution again, I say this every time, that comparing ridership numbers from areas of the county that have a very different number of routes and frequency is a very unjust comparison to places that have far more frequency in their transit service and far more routes. And I find that Gilroy and Morgan Hill get compared ridership numbers that is not at all a fair comparison because of that. All right, thank you.
Yep.
Director Jane.
Yeah, I want to echo what Director Kamei said, and Greg, you actually pointed this out. The hole is getting deeper. The revenues are growing at rates of 2% and 3%, but labor costs are expected to grow 3.5% and then 2.5%. Non-labor costs 3.5%, 2.5%. So, I would like to get some ideas about how we can increase revenues, because transit is inherently a subsidized operation. And as Director Kamei said, that as we expand like the East Ridge, light rail, we add more projects, those have to be subsidized, and sales tax is just going to be flat. So as we build more projects, BART Phase 2 and the light rail, the hole gets deeper and deeper. And so, because you have to fund those operations and they're subsidized, and sales tax is not going to increase at that rate. So I just kind of wanted to understand that. And then I think in your report you outlined that there is no dedicated source of revenue for capital. And that, right now we're taking it from the sales tax, and it's declining because we need to subsidize the other operations. And that's a huge problem in my mind, so.
I don't know if I can give you an exact answer at this point. I mean, I think it's definitely an issue that, again, we recognized when the last 10-year projection was done. It raised the eyebrows for everybody to say there's issues that need to be addressed. It doesn't change for what I see on this one, even though it looks like a balanced budget and everyone can be happy about that. We do have to recognize or identify whether it's, as I said before, if there's internal revenue streams that just need to be developed quicker, and again, whether that's express lanes, whether that's our transit-oriented development and some of the revenues that will ultimately be generated by that development coming back into operations. Those are areas that we might have already in-house that we need to develop plans and ways in which to tap into those resources. I'll say sooner rather than later, but that's a lift that is still required. And then it goes back to, again, the messaging that I think that we have to do as an organization, and I say it's really this 2-year period. I mean, we've got a 2-year period to really, I don't know if it's a reset button, if it's, recalibrate, if it's just we need to start focusing on the transit operations piece so that the product that the county sees and they hear about, and it's a marketing campaign. It's everything associated with getting VTA out there so that people recognize this is what if they need it, it's doing everything they want. If they don't need it, they recognize that it is providing a vital service to the rest of the community, and then they can get behind anything that we would do from a measure perspective. That's what we've got to do. Operationally make sure we're ready, administratively make sure we're ready, strategically make sure we're ready, and then be able to sell that. And it is a sell. We've got to sell that product to the constituents in whatever measure or whatever effort we go for as a new revenue source. So,
Director Rainey?
Yeah, I sort of can't help but challenge that a little bit. The two new revenue sources you mentioned are TOD and express lanes. So express lanes, the money has to be used in the corridor. So I'm struggling to figure out how we get that into operations. It's pretty easy to maybe justify some capital projects in the corridor, bike lanes or something like that. Are we really going to be able to pull any money into operations claiming that it's used in the corridor?
I think as we go through the efforts and identifying these resources, we know that constraint exists. I personally am going to rely on, Jim Lawson and Aaron Quigley from the government affairs perspective to really drive that piece forward for us. But it is an area that we do know that element. We recognize that element, and to say that it's going to automatically go into operations, I don't want to make that blanket statement here. But it is the aspiration that we do have, that we need to convince whoever we need to convince that generating those revenues, helping the operations side, that there is an argument to be made. Listen, I want the whole corridor to be Santa Clara County. That's the corridor to me. But how we redefine that is an exercise that we do have to go through. That's the heavy lift.
And then on the TOD side, the early projects are focused towards a lot of affordable housing. I think we did maybe doing one that's all affordable housing. I don't remember now. We're kind of front-loading our affordable housing side of it, which is not going to pay back. I don't know if it's even going to break even. So again, maybe there's something from TOD much further down the road when we're building less of the affordable housing that will then have higher revenues per unit built kind of thing. So again, I'm concerned a little bit that that's not going to be a very big revenue source for us either anytime soon.
Yeah, TOD to me is going to be one that's a little bit farther down the road. Would it be within this 10-year time frame? I would expect some revenues, some significant revenues could be generated from some of those sites. Keep in mind also that whether it's affordable housing or market rate, they're all ground leases that we have with the developer. So revenues will be generated as we move forward, and Ron and his team they will be presenting, if they haven't already, some projections of what is anticipated as we move forward. Again, those are projections, and when they actually come in, the timing of that is critical. And now whether they will not be, you won't see anything in 26, 27 that shifts this needle. But it is, again, just thinking about long-term, we have revenue streams that we need to work on, develop, and if there are ones that can help mitigate some of this issue, then those are ones we have to address.
And the reason I bring it up is I don't want people to rely too heavily on those two because I'm not seeing them contribute, that we should be looking for another one. And, you know, when we negotiate sales tax measures, for example, Measure B, it was 2016, negotiated 2015, 2014, so a long time ago, we didn't put really very much in for operations. We put some in, and I was told at the time, oh, we thought that would be plenty, but clearly it wasn't plenty. So if another one comes along, I want us to be thinking we need to get a little more aggressive with what we put in for operations.
Agreed.
Chair Kamei.
I'm going to follow your lead because I think that we really do have an opportunity to prepare. When I look at these projections, it seems sort of the status quo. And I think that, you know, I know it isn't going to be next year, the year after that, maybe not for 5 years. But I do believe that we are going to need another measure. And I will tell you that I love public transit. I didn't drive a car until I was 24 when I moved to Morgan Hill. So, you know, I think that we also need to be strategic in our thinking and maybe, you know, sort of think about what are the services that are going to be needed in South County. I represent the west side of San Jose, and, you know, a lot of the emphasis, which I can see is needed on the east side and the BART coming into Dearborn. But, you know, if you live on the west side, you're saying, well, you know, why should I vote for this measure if, you know, I'm not getting any services? Or if I'm in South County and I feel like, well, I don't have any services, why should I be in favor of this? So I think that the timing is now where we really need to prepare and ensure that services throughout the county are kind of like spread a little bit, because I think that when I talk to others in the community about VTA, the only thing they think about is what's happening in the capital projects right now, which, you know, I am in favor for. But at the same time, I think that we need to think strategically in terms of another measure. We are going to need another measure, so we need to find out, or at least have something for those areas that perhaps have not had the same type of attention, because it's going to be needed if we're really going to be able to incorporate some of the things that we want to do, including operating. So I think that we have an opportunity, and everybody knows it takes longer than you think. So if we start now in terms of trying to do some things, little things, to be able to make a difference. So I agree with my colleague that, you know, we need to really like stretch a little bit.
Thanks. And I had a follow-on question on the debt service. That's primarily Measure A debt service? And what about anticipated Measure B debt service, when we would?
You know, right now, in the Measure B projection that I believe some of you have seen when Jane Shen brought it forward in some of the committees, we've got an item in there related to debt service starting in 26, which really is kind of just a placeholder. Right now, there are no specific plans on moving forward with any debt related to B. That could change as time goes on. I mean, we'll evaluate the overall, we're going to monitor that more on the cash availability than it is on the appropriation or the allocations that are made to the various projects. But when we start getting a sense that the allocations that have been identified and the actual request for those dollars to be utilized starts increasing substantially, and we start seeing that balance get to a point where we feel like we need to bond fund some of those things, then we'll begin that process. But again, we've got something built into 26. I would be surprised if there's debt service in fiscal year 26 related to Measure B. Right now, I think the cash balance is somewhere in the neighborhood of $920 million of B availability. So we'll monitor that with some of the bigger constraints that are going to come forward.
So is it fair to say that we don't have it projected because we really don't know when or how much, but that we anticipate that there will be additional debt service at some point along this path?
Yeah, I think that we can assume at some point there will be some debt service related to B. And again, that'll be funded completely out of B.
Okay. And let me ask colleagues, do we want to take a 5-minute break or so at this time and then continue? Cool. All right. Thanks.
Add more fruit. Thank you. Nice to meet you. I've seen you on, yesterday's INF too, but I don't know that I've met you in person or introduced myself. Marie Blakely,
Yeah, nice
Mayor
to meet you.
Gilroy.
Yeah, so
Sorry. Talk over you now.
I used to live in Morgan Hill, and then I remarried and moved to San Jose. But
Right.
was
Well, I knew you
there-
had to live there now since you're a council over there.
It's
Yeah.
not only Morgan Hill and Gilroy that has difficult service. I don't get it
West
either.
side.
in
No,
my-
it's probably
in
true.
South
Recording stopped.
Okay, we ready to start again?
Recording in progress.
All right, we'll reconvene at this time. Greg, you ready to take the next leg?
Absolutely. Actually, I want to leave this slide up here just as a clarification for everybody. The debt service, we talked about that a little bit. The debt service that's showing on this is actually related to the 1976 sales tax measure for those bonds. And what's happening is 2000 Measure A is making a contribution from A into the operating fund to help pay for that debt service. And so what's happening is that debt service is actually falling off at that time period around fiscal year 28. But as I said before, the revenue coming in from Measure A is also falling off. So still a net neutral impact, but I just wanted to clarify that the debt service here is not 2000 Measure A, but is the 1976 measure. With that, we will move to the next slide. Well, the next two slides, I guess. Am I doing it? No. Okay. Okay, VTA Transit Capital. Probably historically, you would have been presented a slew of projects and you would have looked at them and we would have talked about them. But unfortunately, this is a significant area where I have wreaked havoc on the process. So as the capital process was moving forward and we began reviewing the list of projects, I became concerned with really the volume of projects that we were contemplating. And I'll say this, the concern was not necessarily from a funding perspective, but really from an execution and priority perspective. And we'll go over a little bit of why I had that reservation on the next slide, but before we get there, and at the same time, as I referred to it before, new leadership was coming on board. And each of those new leaders were identifying critical projects that needed to be implemented or needed to be evaluated. So as a result, we've sort of slowed down the transit capital process. And again, this is just on the transit capital side. Effectively, what I'm attempting to do with the core group of folks is evaluate the status and the eventual priority of what I refer to as previously approved projects. And these are ones that might be on the books from fiscal year 2015, 2014, 2013, whatever, before we began what is referred to as the skip process last year. So it's really just trying to identify those existing projects, determine if there is some consolidation that can occur to more effectively utilize those already budgeted dollars, and then ultimately keep a focus on what we recognize today as some critical needs that we've got in facility improvements. And again, this is where I would go back to the wheel that we talked about on the transit operation focus, promoting a healthy work environment, as well as exceed passenger expectations. And on the promote healthy work environment, this is the one area where, for those of you that have had the opportunity to go out with Derek and some of the government affairs folks and visit the yards, again, people are phenomenal. The environment in which they're working in could do some work. There is a lot of stuff that we need to do that really is, we're sending a message right now to the employees that is not a good message, and that needs to change. And so the facilities themselves need to be improved. We need to find those areas, identify that work, and start doing that now. And that's where we've sort of slowed down this process. So Derek has provided really a list of what I would refer to as the green, yellow, red sort of scenarios of all of the different facilities. We're evaluating it, along with the rest areas along the routes for the bus drivers that some of you have heard about in previous board meetings, where we just simply need to do the things that we need to do to provide an environment for our people to, one, feel safe, but two, feel appreciated. And so those facility improvements are critical to what we're doing, along with bus stop improvements, light rail platform improvements, all of those things to encourage the passenger participation. Other areas, critical infrastructure. We've had really too many situations right here at River Oaks as it relates to electrical, network, generator issues, and those exist all throughout the system. We need to identify what those are, those critical items, and get those taken care of sooner rather than later. Overall safety, security, but at the same time, we do have mandates, and whether it's the zero emission, non-revenue vehicle, overall infrastructure, state of good repair, those are things that need to be evaluated as well. But it's really taking a step back, trying to identify the things that are out there that we can do some consolidation and really use some of the funds that have already been budgeted and not necessarily identify new dollars to be used just yet. So as we go to the next slide, and this was just, I'll be honest, just a quick little thing that I used for myself when I was trying to think through this process, but it just gives you an idea of what I was concerned about. The first column is what I refer to as previous. These are all projects that basically have been budgeted, monies are out there, and can be done. But there's about 192 projects in various ways of progress. Some may have been started and maybe they're close to being closed. Some may just need to be closed. Others, nothing's been done yet. And that total amount is about $234 million of what we have identified and budgeted, and those dollars are there to be spent. So there's not a risk, per se, of those dollars. Additionally, during last year's, or the last, what would have been last year, I guess, the SCIP process, the Strategic Capital Investment Program or Plan, there were certain projects that would have gone through the process and didn't make the cut. Well, those then get reintroduced to the process. The ones that would have come forward in fiscal year 24-25 equate to about 44 projects. Requested dollars of $104 million doesn't necessarily mean all of those would be done, but that's the magnitude. And then the current request, when we did the project request for 24 and 25, the amount of new projects that were brought forward totaled about 79 for about $131 million. So if you just added all those up, if we said yes, even if we prioritized and did whatever, the magnitude here is that you're talking about 336 projects that need to get completed. I don't know how we're going to complete 336 projects in a timely manner. So that's what we're trying to do. We're taking a step back, evaluating all of these projects that exist, consolidations that can occur, utilizing dollars that exist to projects that are necessary now, and then evaluate some of the more immediate core projects in that 24-25 request. So that's the effort that is still ongoing. So the hope is that we would have a capital program that would come to the board for this before the beginning of the fiscal year. I will be honest, if we don't have that, I'm not going to be of a real concern. It doesn't mean that we can't come forward 2 months into the fiscal year and bring forward a capital budget at that time. But tremendous amount of work will still go on to make that happen, especially for some of the projects that I'd like to see funded or at least identified as projects as we begin July 1st. And so we'll do everything we can to at least bring forward those. And again, the part of this effort, again, comes to funding as well. What I'm trying to prevent is where we basically lock money, and then you don't have it available to do the things that you need to do that might pop up or that are more critical in nature. And so we're trying to be a little bit more judicious, I guess, in the utilization of those funds that exist. And that's kind of the focus that we've got as we move forward. That sort of leads into the other slide, which is sort of a policy change proposal that will be coming forward. The major one is really what I would consider creating a separate capital fund. Currently, the capital fund exists within what is referred to as the debt reduction fund. The debt reduction fund, basically was created several years ago, I think with the intent of having some of that debt that's out there, feeling that maybe if we wanted to pay it off a little bit sooner, that we would put this fund in place. My preference at this point would be to create a more dedicated capital fund, specific really from my perspective, specific in cash, and identified every year as we close an operating cycle from a surplus perspective. I would like to, in the proposal that you'll see coming forward when we present the budget, will be utilizing $100 million from what is now the debt reduction fund. The debt reduction fund at the end of fiscal year 22 was about $317 million. Majority of that 317 was really related to the residual amounts of CARES, CRISA, and ARP dollars that just flowed through the system and became our operating surplus for those prior years that we saw. So the idea would be to utilize $100 million of that debt reduction fund, create the capital fund as sort of a seed money for future needs. At the same time, ensuring that every year, assuming there is a surplus, that surplus in the aggregate would then flow to the capital fund as well. If you think about the framework of what I'm hoping happens is I don't know if we can go back. Can you go back a couple of slides to the, oh no, you know what, never mind. It'll go too far back. Our fiscal year 23 projection right now, you won't recall it, but I'll throw the numbers out. I think it was about a $23 million projected surplus for fiscal year 23 is what we're showing. With that $23 million is also the line item capital transfer of $40 million. So in theory, if everything holds true for fiscal year 23, there's basically $63 million that can move into the capital fund at the end of fiscal year 23. The preference would be you utilize that money for the needs that we've got for 24 and 25, along with utilizing some of the prior approved project dollars in consolidating some of those needs. And so you're really not even touching that initial 100. But that 100 is there to ensure that we can plan for that as we move forward for future needs. And then, as we showed on the 24-25 budget, there's a line item, capital transfer. Ideally, we would see that $80 million would go into the capital fund and really be planned for the years 26 and 27, that we're not relying on 24 and 25 activities to fund 24 and 25 capital. And again, it goes back to having that dedicated funding source when we begin a capital or a biennial budget period. The preference here is to say we have X amount of capital projects, and here is the dedicated funding source that has no strings attached. So then, when we get into 26 and 27, we'll have the results of 24 and 25 to be able to build as we move forward. So the capital fund is really one to identify that initial seed money just to ensure that those dollars exist, also allow for longer term planning for some of the items that might come forward, but also then ensure that we've got funds available for the current process. The other proposal here, and this is just a minor thing that I sort of had a little issue with, the operating reserve. To me, an operating reserve is really for your operating costs. The way that the resolution was passed in the past, it actually calls it the operating budget, which is your total operating budget, which gets into your capital transfer and others. My preference is that we just simply identify it as the operating expenses and then have a 15% reserve related to that number rather than the capital reserve component. So that'll be the other policy change that comes forward. That was a short piece because now we have other opportunities for feedback and questions.
Colleagues, Director Kamei.
I'm sorry, I have a lot of questions. Since I'm new, as I look at...
Makes two of us, but keep going, yes, that's good.
As I look at the many projects, and this is on your transit capital. How do the, I mean, I just imagine that projects get prioritized. And, you know, as you look at the previous ones, the script ones, and then the new ones, it seems to me that there has to be like a triage process, right? And of course, there are those that you have to do, you're going to do, that's already sort of in the pipeline. So when you're looking at, I mean, this is a lot of, these are a lot of projects. So I'm just assuming that you go through that process and come up with recommendations on saying, okay, we have to do this because obviously for IT or for electrical or for whatever it is, it just needs to be done, right? So I don't understand, you know, in terms of the request here as we're looking at this.
So if you think of the process really got, I would call it a little bit more refined in the last, I say the last budget cycle, but it was really in the last year of the last budget cycle when what was referred to as the SKIP process was created. And that began more of a prioritization that you're referring to, a point-based system that every project that people are identifying as what they need then goes through various levels of review from manager level, and then a kind of a senior management perspective, and then overall chiefs will review along, and then evaluating scores, evaluating priorities. So that prioritization process is in place.
Okay.
The problem that I'm finding with it now is it's because that prioritization is in place, what's getting lost is some of those previous projects that are still in the books, that what are we doing with those? And again, some might still be active and moving forward in very aggressive ways. Some may simply be that the resources aren't always there to ensure that those projects continue to move forward. And they just sort of, I'm not going to say they get lost or forgotten, but it's just priorities change, priorities shift. And so now you had that, but now you're focused on this. And what I'm hoping to do in this process is some of those previous projects is to really prioritize, if they're critical, then let's figure out how we're going to get those done, and those will be things we focus on now. Or if some of these newer projects that are coming forward have higher priorities, let's figure out if the ones from the previous really are needed, and if they're not, let's utilize those dollars to fund these projects. And that's kind of the evaluation that we're going through now, of really identifying priorities of those previous, making sure that they still need to happen, along with any of the new projects that come forward.
So I guess I'm surprised that previous projects that have already sort of like passed the, you know, sort of like that you were going to do, sort of languish or whatever. You know, I mean, I think that the issue for me would then be, you know, coming up with a tracking system or some tool to be able to ensure that as you look at all projects, that, you know, there are outcomes for each project and that they get done.
Right.
You know, I mean, it seems a little bit sort of surprising to me that you would have 192 previous projects and there's just sort of not in the mix.
Right.
That doesn't make sense to me.
No, I appreciate that, and I'll be honest, this is not something that's new to me. It's my past experience at the Atlanta airport. You would have every so often you would evaluate all of the projects, and you would see that some just got lost or forgotten. It's just a process, and then new priorities come on, and it's an effort that needs to happen every so often. But I think also it's, to your point before, I think what we've missed as an organization is true, whether it's a project manager, project management office, however you want to call it, of having some body that is really managing the overall capital piece. So we've actually begun discussions with Casey Yamoto, who's our EPD chief, to figure out, is there another way for us to manage all of these capital projects? Because historically, each project is within each chief's domain. and there's not really a central process to control or manage. And that's the effort, to your point, that we're going to be looking at as we move into fiscal year '24, to find that central process so we can track these projects and really hold folks accountable.
Yeah, well, it seems to me that even if you had it at different levels, this, as a project, that it would be part of somebody's responsibility to say, okay, I'm the lead on this.
Sure.
And it should get done. So I guess I'm not understanding.
Well, I don't have an answer for that. I think it's just, whether it's been events that have occurred, change in leadership, change in positions, to me, it's we're at that natural point where this now needs to be fixed, and that's what we're addressing.
Thank you.
Director Foley.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, and I just want to follow up on some of the comments that Vice Mayor Keme mentioned. So 192 is a lot of previous projects in place that are being identified, and I'm wondering, and you're doing an analysis on that, so will you be bringing back the analysis to us, and we'll make the final decision on whether those projects are still relevant or not? What's the process with that analysis?
Can't say that I've thought it through completely to that point, but I think what would happen is, because we are, if we are changing the makeup, in my opinion, of the already approved projects from the past, then I would be anticipating bringing forward to the body those changes that are being identified. So if we're repurposing an old project, I would identify that this was a project approved whenever, and now we're going to repurpose it to this. So there will be a reconciliation process that would go on. Some will stay, and some, like I said, some of these, the 192 is every project, so they could be close to being finished or whatever else. But those that need to be addressed, those are the ones that I would expect we would bring to you a sort of a reconciliation process so that you can prove it.
Okay, I appreciate that. I think that would be really helpful for us to weigh in on that. But I'm curious about the 192, of how many of those, how long ago that list was created. Are there many on that list that are today irrelevant?
Correct.
Due to demand, due to technology changes, due to a lot of other things? And is that list not relevant anymore, and the important areas of facility improvements that you articulated very clearly, the infrastructure, safety and security, all of those things, shouldn't we be looking at those things instead of reserving money for these 192 projects? And is that, those 192 projects, that budget is sitting aside in reserve somewhere for those projects to be completed?
Correct. And I think your point is exactly what I'm hoping we're able to do is, some of the older, some of those 192, call it, may have elements that relate to some of the things we want to do now. And that's what we're looking at to say, okay, whatever the priority was that created that project then probably doesn't exist. However, those funds and where they're appropriated for the purpose they were identified, now we can use them for facility enhancements for the yards or technology improvements overall. That's that exercise that I would expect us to come forward with to be able to show you.
I appreciate that. So, because we're talking about the budget and we're looking at a budget cycle, approving a budget cycle, when will you be able to get that list more detailed, more honed down? When will you be able to incorporate that? Better question is, will you be able to incorporate those changes in the budget as it comes forward? Or will you? You're looking at me like, no.
I would like to say yes. I think what I could offer as what will potentially come forward from a budget perspective is a continuing conversation of the work that we're doing on the previous. But for those projects that are not already on the books that we know need to move forward, I would like to be prepared before we pass the budget to identify at least those projects for 24 and 25 that need funding, or that need to have dedicated funding for those to be able to move forward. So in the budget process, I may identify those for you to approve. It doesn't mean we are not continuing the efforts on the previous and other work.
Okay, and as a follow-up to the list, the seed money you're looking for of 100 million, is that where you might get the budget, the line item budget for that, for those projects?
That would probably be the backstop for this particular year. And then the results of fiscal year '23 would basically replace that 100 million.
Okay. And because I'm new, as a few of us are on here, and we're just trying to get our hands around all of the budget issues, tell me a little bit more about the debt reduction fund. What is that? How is it utilized? Because you're looking to pull funds from it,
Yeah.
so.
I would call the debt reduction fund, again, was created as a fund to capture dedicated dollars should there be a desire to, and this was several years ago, when there might have been an opportunity to maybe pay off debt a little bit sooner. And it was an idea to go ahead and put dollars in that fund for that purpose. It was also identified for capital needs. The concern I've got from the debt service, or from the debt reserve fund, or debt reduction fund, is it can fluctuate year over year just simply based on activities within our overall balance sheet. And what I want to do is have a dedicated, really what I'm calling cash account dedicated to capital. And so that's where I want to pull what is now a cash funded amount in that debt reduction fund and create that on the capital side. It's your accumulated retained earnings for the life of VTA is really what that number represents. And I simply want to pull that 100 million, created that capital fund, and leave that in there. It is also there ultimately for future decisions from capital perspective. It's an additional little reserve that exists should we need it long term. If we decided to pay down debt, we could do it for that purpose. It could be another path for us in addition to this first $100 million. If there's another capital program that we need to fund and we want to utilize it and there's no other mechanism to do that, again, longer term, bigger project, that could also be a seed opportunity for us.
So you don't see, thanks, you don't see any risk from transferring some of the funds from the debt reduction fund as you're suggesting?
No, ma'am.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chair. That's it for me.
Director Blankley.
Thank you. Good timing, because on the debt reduction fund, does VTA have a Section 115 trust, kind of fund where you're putting money in to earmark to pay down PERS debt?
No.
Okay,
I'm
so
aware.
that's not part of the debt reduction fund.
Not specifically identified, no.
Okay, then when you, in your slide where you say that part of your proposal would be that operating performance surplus transfer to the capital fund, where is it currently going now? Is that what comes before the board to decide? That's what we do in our city, but I'm asking here.
The waterfall right now basically has it going into the into that debt reduction fund. So the prior years, so how it's gotten built up over the last several years is because of the surplus that's been generated by the CARES, CRISA, and ARP dollars that have flowed through the financial statements. So that's fundamentally what's been creating that account over the last several years.
But under the proposal you would suggest when it gets to the board, would any operating performance surplus automatically go to the capital fund?
Yes, that would be the proposal I would
That's what
put
your
forward.
proposal is, right, so there'd be less in here. Okay, and for the operating reserve calculation, what you're proposing would reduce the amount on which, would reduce the total amount that goes into the reserve, right? Because 15% of operating expenses is going to be less than 15% of operating expenses plus
Yeah.
capital transfer, right?
If you assume that the $40 million holds true every year, then it's really just I realized this as I went through it, it's a 1 year hit, or 1 year adjustment. Because then every other year, you would still have the same 15% calculation would be off that gross number, which includes a $40 million sort of, plug, I'll call it the capital transfer. But yes, and really, it's more of me just looking at it. When I see an operating reserve, I see it as operating expenses that are necessary should something happen.
Yes.
And it's just tying that
Right.
what I
No, I
consider a
understand.
loose
I
end.
just wanted to
Yep.
know what the numbers, how the numbers work out.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
I had one question on the existing debt. Do we know approximately, or probably a range, but what interest rates are tied to that debt?
Coupon rates, I think, are sitting at about maybe 5% is the coupon rate. We have swaps that are in place right now that we're basically trying to come to a synthetic fixed rate that from I think if you would think about it from an effective yield perspective, lower than that 5% overall, but probably in a 3.5, 3.8 range.
Okay, thanks. Director Kameh.
Thank you. I was just looking at page 93 of the proposed biennial budget, and I noticed that the debt reduction fund is quite sizable. And as I was looking at the description here, it says it was created quite some time ago, and it's sort of primarily used for the local portion of the VTA Transit Capital Program and to keep assets in good repair. So to me, keeping them, I mean, that sounds more like just, things that you need to fix. So if we were to pull 100 million out of that and put it, would it just appear as a separate line item on the net assets here, or,
Yeah,
or how would it be reflected, and does it sort of align with the original sort of why it was put together?
Yeah, and again, you're right about the debt, how the debt reduction funding includes a capital piece. The capital fund, to me, it just clearly articulates that this is the purpose for these particular funds, and it provides what I would call a dedicated source on a budgeting basis as we move forward. The way it would be depicted on that same page you just showed, we would identify, in theory, I would call it's a subset of that capital or of that debt reduction fund, but we would show it separately, and I think we've got a line item in there that ultimately will get updated depending on how we move forward with it.
So the remaining balance then would remain as the debt reduction fund, and then there would be another line that says capital fund.
Yeah, actually, your point's valid. I may at the same time come up with a different term to use for whatever that last reserve number is. But
Yeah, because you already have a line that says capital fund.
that was added. That's added. That was added here with anticipation of creating a capital fund. So that's just, if this moves forward, that's what that line item would create.
Okay, so it's reflecting that there's money in there?
And that, again, it's more the exercise of what's occurred for 22 and 23 to sort of, if it was in place, here's how it would flow through. Right now, I would say this is pretty much a draft of how that would happen, but the idea was to show that if this capital fund existed, this is the beginnings of how this would work.
And it would appear
work.
on this line that says capital fund?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is draft?
It's a work in process.
Okay,
Yes.
Okay.
And is capital fund and capital project fund the same thing? I just see
Yes,
both terms.
if they're both, they both would be the same
They're
for
the
me.
same thing.
Yes,
Okay,
we'll
thank
make sure that's
Consistent.
consistent.
And I just want everybody to look at our time check.
Yes.
And we have one more section, and then members of the public, and then a wrap-up discussion. So, Director Lee.
Greg, I'm sorry. Looking at that page 93, I'm actually a little bit more lost than before the questions were asked. Sorry.
sorry.
Rosemary. Because you say you added the capital fund as in anticipation of the creation of the fund. The debt reduction fund, when you look at those for 22, 23, 24, 25, that is still fairly consistent. So the 100 did not get transferred to the capital fund based on this. And then I see a 19.7 million for 23, then 24 suddenly dropped to zero. And it makes one become 37.5, so I'm just lost.
Yeah, and again, I'll apologize for this. I think we were attempting to at least put in here, and again, this will all be updated once we get to a final budget book. The idea was to at least insert that capital fund that would reflect the operational impact, surpluses, whatever else from prior years that would possibly flow through capital funds. So that was the intent of putting this particular slide in here. We did not want to assume that the 100 million was going to be in there because that's, again, a board action that I didn't want to make that assumption for this purpose. So all of that will be adjusted accordingly, and this book would be adjusted finally once the budget is adopted, and then we'll make all of those revisions accordingly.
Okay, so it's rough enough draft, let's not worry about it until we see the new one. Okay.
Yeah.
My only point is on the number of projects on VTA Transit Capital, I think there's a pretty much a consensus that I think this board would like to see what those projects are in the spreadsheet of some sort.
Yeah, I think, yeah, we'll get to the point where I can show all of the different projects and really that reconciliation of where things stand.
Right, the
Yeah.
projects to progress, like
Sure.
where they're at, and then, or even priority at the end, basically like, look, some of these are really high priority, have to do it, and there might be, I don't know, 5, 10 projects, like, let's not do these, or
Right.
it's just, doesn't worth it, right? Yeah, that would be really helpful. Thank you, that's all I have.
Yeah, Director Rennie, and then Director Jane.
Hopefully this will be not too long a question. So we have a big dollar number coming with the light rail, new cars or redo. I can't recall what year. I think there was some different years when we were going to need to start doing that. And are we thinking that's going to come out of the debt reduction fund? Where do we think that big, can you remind us what that dollar is? I'm thinking like it's 100 million or some big number. I can't recall now.
I'm afraid it might be bigger than that. I don't. Yeah, I think it's close to 500 million of the light rail piece. But I do think, so we talked about it yesterday again in SSTPO. There's work being done to determine the exact timing of when that decision needs to be made. Where those funds come from was always going to be an item for discussion. The possibility does exist that should this debt reduction fund still have the available dollars in there, that could be one option. If nothing else, maybe leveraging it for some sort of financing potential to purchase those. But that is always an option that we'd have to look at as available funds.
Director Jane?
So I'm actually pretty confused here, and I was not asleep. So, typically we take about $40 million from our operating fund and put it into the capital. But most of our capital expenses are paid for by state and federal grants. So this is kind of an additional. And then the debt reduction fund, I think you said was coming from ARPA money and some other money. That's why it's so big. So my question is, we've typically funded the capital from operating at a rate of 40 million, but now you're proposing to put 100 million in there. So I'm wondering why so much for that, and then what do you plan to leave in there? And it seems like what you're looking for is a slush or a contingency or emergency fund to fund sort of projects that we think are important that weren't actually budgeted, right?
Okay.
So it doesn't seem like that should be $100 million that we wouldn't put in there. So I'm trying to understand, and then I see that the amount of money projected in the 10-year is going from 40 million down to 21 million over time. So how are we going to keep this capital fund funded at the level that we need, which is probably 40 million and going up?
Yeah, and I guess where I've struggled with this, really since I've been here, is we'll have a line item that says $40 million transfer to capital, right? If at the end of the year we have a deficit of, let's just say, $15 million, I don't have $40 million to transfer to capital. So I can't make that commitment to the capital that $40 million is going to be there, because those dollars at the end of the year don't exist. So the idea behind creating the fund, and whether it's 50 million or 100 million, I'll have conversations about what that right number should be. It's really to ensure that we've got what I would consider a dedicated source when the time comes when we evaluate projects in that current fiscal year or that current biennial period, that the funds necessary to fund those projects exist. We're not relying on that current year's operation budget to fund those current year's projects, because we don't know if the budget will actually come through as such. But to approve projects at the same dollar amount, and then all of a sudden those dollars aren't available, we've put ourselves in a potential hole. So this is all, the intent here is to create that seed to allow for that planning effort that says we can use these dollars for 24, 25 if necessary. And then whatever comes out of operations for 24, 25 become your 26, 27. So you always have the ability to know precisely what your numbers are when you're building your capital side based on known dollars. And that's really what I think the attempt is to do. And whether it's 50 or 100, I hear your point. And trust me when I say this, I don't like locking funds up just to lock them up. But I also want them available for us to be able to utilize for projects that are necessary. And so whether that's 50, 100, or 25, again, to your point, if whatever we seed it with, if we say we need more later on from the board's perspective, I'd be coming to you with that same request of moving it from that same debt reduction fund piece into that capital fund. But solely for that purpose of creating what I consider that dedicated source that everyone knows and sees that that's capital and capital only.
Got it, thank you.
Okay, you want to go on to the next section?
Not particularly, but yes, we can go on. This next group really meant to, I'll call it just fly right through. So we'll see if that actually happens. So these are all of the remaining funds. And again, like we said, our main focus today was on transit, but these are other funds, other programs that ultimately will come forward for this body and others to approve. So first one, congestion management program. I think this went through yesterday on CMPP. Again, these are all, and I want to make sure this is clear, fiscally separate from VTA transit. Funded from other sources, not part of the VTA transit operations side. Focus on increasing efficiency on transit and roadway systems, planning improvements to those systems, and ultimately improving land use decision-making process to support those system investments. So that's really the focus of what the congestion management program does. The revenues showing there at $6.26 million come from various places, a lot of member agencies, but also federal, state grants, the grant program, administration fees, and then the STIP, or the State Transportation Improvement Program, also has some funds there. The key thing on this one, just to make sure everyone is aware, as you'll see on this, the revenues for the year are projected to be 6.2, in both years, 6.26 and 6.71. Expenses are projected to be higher than that, which creates a deficit from that perspective. There is a fund balance or a reserve that exists within the congestion management program, and we would utilize that reserve, which is really what it's intended for. It's just the residual monies that exist to be able to be used for the overall program. And those would just simply fund that $930,000 and $370,000 difference. So that's congestion management. The next one is the Silicon Valley Express Lanes program. I think this is somewhat self-explanatory. It's really just the overall tolling exercise that we've got for State Road 237 and US 101. Revenues here are projected at $12.12 million and $12.63 million, with expenses slightly lower than that. I would offer that we're probably a little conservative on the revenue side as it relates to this, because fiscal year 23 projected revenue is about 15.7. If I'm not mistaken, we do not, at least I hope we don't. I don't think we budget for penalties and assessments. I'd rather not, as long as we have the revenues under the core system to capture all the expenses. I would just look to those as being upside for any of the budget perspective. On the TOD development, again, this is still, I don't want to say in the infancy stages. It's the TOD fund has been in place for several years, but dedicated to bring in revenues associated with properties that we own. Ultimately, it will be the holder of the revenues generated from ground leases, or even other sales of property, things of that nature that are affiliated with VTA-owned property. Expenses simply to maintain the program itself. From a capital budget perspective, this just simply reflects dollars that are needed to support the overall program. So whether it's development costs, both feasibility and design, environmental, overall reviews and studies, all related to the programs and projects that we have going on with affordable housing, market rate housing, things of that nature. Current funded reserves for this one stands at about $24.5 million, so that's where the funding will come from to ensure that the capital budget is taken care of. On the VTP capital program, this is kind of the big dog in this one for the most part. This is ongoing projects related to highway, express lanes, bicycle, and ped, as well as complete streets. So some of the other areas are more in the planning focus and administering some of these overall programs. Once these projects become projects, this is the area where they're going to be funded out of. You know, for me, the Measure B dollars are probably the more readily available, but that all depends on other funding sources. I think the key thing here, and Member Jane sort of referred to this before, this is one area where approval of the projects ultimately when they come forward is critical in securing state and federal funding for these projects as we move forward. So once they see the board approval and they see it as an approved project, then it becomes easier or necessary for the state and Fed to see. 2000 Measure A, next slide, sales tax program. This is really the sales tax piece that comes in. We talked a little bit about it before as it relates to sort of relationship to the 1976 sales tax. I can already see here now that I'm looking at it again. We'll evaluate and look at the revenues that are showing for both 24 and 25 and make sure that we've got that consistency in all of the sales tax pieces that are here. The expenses for this really are the O&M piece that flows into the operation side and then also the debt service that's there. The residual amount then flows through for utilization for capital needs that exist for whether it's BART Phase 2, EBRC, or any other remaining Measure A projects. The next slide is identifying, it's kind of the semantics thing. It's the 2000 Measure A sales tax program capital, but it's not necessarily all funded by Measure A, so I want to make sure people realize that. But all other funding sources, the projects themselves are identified within this fund. The two key projects that exist today that are really out of this particular fund are the BART Phase 2 and then the EBRC project. Those are the main projects there. The next slide is our 2008 Measure B, the BART Operating Sales Tax Program. This is, from a 2008 Measure B perspective, the dedicated source of funds to help pay for what we refer to as O&M costs for the BART, both Phase 1 and ultimately Phase 2 extension. O&M here refers to both operating and maintenance as well as certain capital costs that are necessary to ensure the overall operations and maintenance of the system. What's not shown on this is the anticipated revenues. So for fiscal year 24 and 25, there's about $87 million in 24 and $91 million in 25. Those are either the 2008 Measure B receipts or projected fair revenues from BART ridership at this point. So those two amounts would net to about $22.7 and $15.6 million deficits for 24 and 25. Those two deficits would then be funded out of the remaining 2008 Measure B dollars that exist from our net position. And as it exists right now, fiscal 23's net position for BART, or for the 2008 Measure B, is about $416 million. So those dollars are available to fund that 15 or 22 and $15 million deficit. And then I think lastly is the 2016 Measure B. Most in this room, I think, have seen the 2016 Measure B sales tax program that's being proposed that Jane Shin has prepared and presented in the past. The next slide shows the current budget allocations proposed First, for the formula-based programs, which are really direct calculations that are made, and those dollars are allocated accordingly. And then on the needs-based, just identifying where some of those projects exist and where the funding needs are anticipated to come from, resulting in an overall appropriation of about $907 million that would be coming forward for use of Measure B in the 24-25 timeframe. That was a rapid-fire review of those. We will break and ask for feedback and/or questions.
Good, and then just so everybody knows, after this go-round, we'll hear from the public, and then we'll try and go into a wrap-up. Any questions or comments? Director Jane.
This is sort of diving into the weeds here. For the express lanes, the budgeted revenue for '23 was $8.7 million, but the projected actual is $15.9 million, like almost double. But then the proposed budget for the next 2 years is less than what our actual was for the previous year. So it dropped by $3 million, almost $4 million. So I wanted to understand why there was a drop from the actuals from '23 to the proposed. I know you're trying to be conservative, but then the expenses, professional and special services, went from $5.3 million to $7.3 million. So professional services went up by $2 million for each of the next 2 years. So I just wanted to understand that, because we're actually making $8.7 million in '23, but that only goes down to less than $2 million in the next 2 years. So I wanted to understand.
Yeah. I will probably have some time with the Express Lanes team to evaluate whether we want to continue moving forward with this particular budget as it is. Your points are valid. Number one, I think from an expense perspective, it's probably more accurate of what to anticipate because of overall use of the lanes and then just the administrative costs necessary to continue providing, those lanes as they are and the back office support that's necessary to do this particular work. On the revenue side, again, I think utilization is far exceeding, number one, what was anticipated. Do I think that particular either growth or activity was projected in even the base revenues for fiscal years 24 and 25? That might have been a more conservative approach just on the base revenue piece. Keeping in mind also the 23 number does include, and I don't know the exact numbers right now, but it does include fines and penalties that are also part of the revenue stream. Those are not part of any projections for the 24-25. My preference would be not to include them, especially if regular revenues can take care of the overall operations. Then, we're not relying, in theory, on fines and penalties to help support it. If we have to get to the point where we're relying on fines and penalties, then we need to sort of revisit the process a little bit.
Didn't we waive all the fines and penalties?
I don't know if we weigh. I have to follow. I know we've done some work on prior stuff we waived. I think it went through. Going forward, I think we've done some adjustments to what the fines and penalties are and how much can be billed to individuals. But going forward, there still will be fines and penalties.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else? All right.
Mesmerizing.
Yes. I did have a question on slide 40, which was the Measure A. And can you explain a little bit more on that net revenue for over expenses, a big item, and is that the uses for that or anticipated uses of that?
Yeah, so really what's happening now is on the 2000 Measure A, that, in this case, that 143, along with any residual amounts from prior years, that is ultimately what's being utilized to help fund the capital side of this same 2000 Measure A. So most of the dollars right now being utilized beyond the operating and maintenance piece and the debt service is us providing funding for the BART Phase 2 component of some of the ongoing costs, PM services, design services, things of that nature for the project. The main source of funding for BART Phase 2 right now is this particular fund. That will shift a little bit to 2000 Measure B, but that residual amount of 143 basically becomes the cash available to fund the capital component of that same program.
So I don't think we'll have an opportunity to dive into this today, but I'm really interested in understanding more deeply on those funds and kind of revisiting how we're using Measure A. There were a number of capital projects that were anticipated and committed that then went by the wayside, and which of any of those might still have funding opportunities in part or in whole from Measure A beyond the BART Phase 2.
Okay, yes, we can revisit that.
All right, so if it's okay, at this time we'll hear from members of the public. We have one member here in the room who would like to speak, and then we'll see if we have others more remotely. Doug Muirhead, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here in person. I am Doug Muirhead from Morgan Hill, and topic is exceed rider expectations. Your general manager under VTA Forward is planning a new Next Network study. The public learned from the previous network plan that you have two conflicting goals. One is ridership, where transit is run as a business with fare box recovery, and the second is coverage, where transit is a social benefit in the extreme, any person, any place, any time. So please keep in mind that your customers come from three pools, currently 85% routes for ridership, 15% for coverage, and a third pool I would like to ride in the future if only fill in the blank pool. Thank you.
And do we have any members of the public who remotely would like to speak?
Yes, we have two hands raised. We'll begin with Blair, then Eugene. Blair, please accept the unmute and begin speaking when ready.
Hi, Blair Beekman here. I arrived a little late to the second half of the presentation. This was a 3-hour presentation, and for yourselves to only allow 1 minute of public comment, it's a bit insulting and it's a bit exacerbating that you have made the meeting process so efficient to not allow a little bit more public comment when needed sometimes. I hope you can work on this issue and learn how to be more flexible with public comment in the future. For myself, this item, I just wanted to comment on the importance of, that we are working on, I have spoken at many public comment times around the Bay Area recently that we have some really good community projects geared for 24 and 25. That it's my hope that how we make decisions for 24 and 25, that they can be positive. What we do now can be positive for the years 24 and 25. And they don't have to be recession-based. They don't have to be disaster capitalism-based. Thanks.
Thank you, Blair. Eugene, please accept the unmute and begin speaking when ready.
Good morning, Board and Committee members. Eugene Bradley, Silicon Valley Transit users. I just wanted to echo Marie Blanca's comments regarding the service, or rather, a lot of the lack of down in South County. I wanted to echo those comments. And this being the 50th anniversary of public transit in Santa Clara County, I understand voters have passed 7 ballot measures to help support it. Before we go considering yet another ballot measure, One of the things that VTA I feel needs to tell the public is how much in inefficiencies and waste that is cut from both operating as well as capital projects. Giving one example, BART Phase 2 going down to Santa Clara, which duplicates existing Caltrain ACE capital corridor, and even proposed San Jose pod people mover from Diridon over to the airport. Also, in that budget document, I want to thank Mr. Richard and his staff. I would like the name of the person who wrote back. It was not.
Chair, there are no more hands raised.
Thank you. All right, so we'll now move into a wrap-up of today's discussion. And Greg, I don't know if you want to, I don't know if you were able to keep up with notes, but things that you have as kind of takeaways so far. Any kind of summation or?
I actually had a couple things. Just reiterate, balanced budget, focus on people, passenger operations. But the one takeaway for me that there's a few items on the sales tax measures, just validating some of those numbers. The key thing for me is on the capital side. That's the biggest outstanding item that needs to be resolved as we move forward. And that'll be basically the focus over the next month and a half as we go through the other process. So,
okay. Colleagues? Director Lopez.
Thank you so much, Greg, for that. You know, this is a tremendous amount of work. I appreciate the forward thinking and some of the policies you proposed to try to get to some better practices. I just want to reemphasize what I heard as a common theme, which is that balancing the need for any revenue discussions, that I see that as tied directly to the service and operations discussions, because to build the support that we need for that, people need to see the results now as much as we get over. I know you understand that you spoke to that directly. I just want to keep that in mind as we go forward. I'm going to really look forward to hearing more on the capital side as that develops, and understanding that piece is going to come a little bit later. But I appreciate the work, and I hope that as we're prioritizing those projects, we're thinking about what's going to offer the biggest efficiencies to let us deliver better service, which is the bottom line. But thank you.
Yep, thank you.
And I'll just share that Greg had alluded to the previous long-term financial forecast that we had seen. Maybe not everybody on this current board had seen them in the previous 2 years, but they were somewhat scary, although long-range financial forecasts tend to start that way before they get resolved. And the other element is that by nature, organizations like ours are deliberately attempting to be modestly conservative in their projections, because that's a better outcome than the other way around, of being over-optimistic and having big shortfalls. I had, when we had these discussions, I guess it was last year, and eyebrows were raised about the long-term deficits, and the question was, Greg, what are you going to do about this? And he says, that's my job to resolve this, and by next year, I expect that we will have make significant progress on that. My sense is that acknowledging this gap that we have all seen on the capital side, this is still more progress on the long-range financial plan in a single year than I had felt I could anticipate. It's not solving all our problems, but it just seems like we're moving in the right direction, and that barring negative financial impacts that are beyond what we are projecting, we may see additional improvement as we move forward in the coming months and years. And so I guess I want to express an appreciation to not only Greg, but the whole staff who have gone into the work that has put us on what looks like a better footing. A lot of work ahead, but a better footing, and I just want to. I don't know. I don't want to express too much of a sigh of relief, but certainly encouragement.
Yeah.
And we have work ahead. So,
No, thank you.
Anyone else?
Do you mind if I just?
Yeah,
I
please.
guess I should just follow it. Number one, thank you for everybody for your attention today. I realize this was sometimes a dry subject to kind of get through. But I hope what you heard today, and you'll see it echoed through whether you do visits to the yards or you see other things that go on with within the organization. The changes that have been made really across the board from a leadership perspective that Carolyn has done as the CEO, minus me, the people that she's brought in over the last several months really are going to make a difference to this organization. And it will require investments. I fully expect that investments will need, and when I say investments, not just capital, that's investing in people, investing in process, and it may result in something that we have to address from a deficit perspective. But we're in a position where we can probably take care of that in this next couple of years. But if we're making the right investments in the right places, then really what you're going to see as we move forward is VTA moving in a much better position and positioning us within our overall community that they see a product that they can be very proud of. So, thank you.
Director Lee.
Just very, very quickly, because everybody wants to leave at this point. I always remind people 3 things that matter to transit. CSO, clean, safe, and on time.
Yep.
Right. Those are really 3 basic things. And don't ever forget that the level of service we talk about is really working on those 3 things. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, on that note, you have 10 minutes to blow. Thank you all.
Great job. I don't know about that.